the guy's story. And so this is going to be one of those. And so we put it in the setting of this battle in Henrico County, just outside of Richmond. And so you see the Battle of Malvern Hill, which, except to the Civil War enthusiasts, may not know much about that battle, and yet it is probably the most significant cavalry battle of the war that you've never heard of, or that you don't know anything about. And the other twist on it, Harrison's Landing, we'll talk about that too, which is where the Union Army said, "No mas, I'm getting the hell out of around Richmond this time, and I need to someplace to go and recover," in Harrison Landing. And the interesting thing to me is not so much Lee did this and Grant did that, is the misery, the personal story of these soldiers, the suffering. What drove these nobodies who didn't have $100 to their name to fight, and the suffering that occurred in these settings. So this is really very much focused on the misery of that these soldiers endured in this particular thing. So we will do our thing. So yeah, soldiers from Lincolnville. So let's see that one. Well, it's been sitting around for 45 minutes. Let me start.
That's pretty.
It just sit, it's got a sat there, probably went to sleep. Okay.
Steve, when this is over, can I talk to you for a few minutes afterwards?
Yeah.
All right. So, just a little background. In 1862, the Union Army decided we're going to take Richmond. And they went up the middle peninsula of Virginia, from the Chesapeake and the land between the York River and the James River. McClellan, with this huge army, lands on the peninsula and makes his way west toward Richmond, following the rivers, to the outskirts of Richmond, which would be to the east side of Richmond, in a series of battles. And there goes McClellan. And the last, actually, you see Lee and McClellan here, but Joseph E. Johnston was actually the Confederate commander at that time. But he was wounded at Seven Pines the 1st of June, and who took over for the rest of the war? Bobby Lee. So it was during this series of battle that Robert E. Lee became the Confederate commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. So the 7 Days battle are what you hear about, because it's really the last week of this peninsular campaign, a series of running battles east of Richmond, following the tributaries of the Chickahominy River. And it ends in Malvern Hill, which is what we're going to talk about on July 1st. So Richmond is there. As you follow this series of battles, one of them, the first one was Chickahominy Bluff, and there's some beautifully preserved Confederate earthworks on the top of this bluff that I photographed. Then, decide whether I'm going to abandon this remote control or not. Beaver Dam Creek was the next one on June 26th. And I stomped around that ground and found the creek, Beaver Dam Creek, one of the tributaries of Chickahominy. And if you can imagine, guys fighting on both sides of that creek. That was the next battle. Let's keep going. Gaines Mill. One of the few, like we'll see on Malvern Hill, one of the few battlefields that's still beautifully preserved. And you'll see on this video. If this apple play for you. This beautiful farm field that was full of Union troops and the Confederate guys coming out of those woods. It was actually the last battle of the war, and this is 1862, that the Confederates had a numerical advantage in a major battle, Gaines Mill. But McClellan always thought he was outnumbered. Okay, so on we go. The next series of battles there in the 7 days, you see them listed there, but I have no photographs because the battlefields are not preserved. They're not there anymore. A few signs, but that's it. And they follow these geographic locations until the final clash at Malvern Hill. If you look at Malvern Hill in eastern Henrico County from this Google map, it's a beautifully preserved battlefield. It's one of the few in Virginia that the preservation, the fields, the streams, even the tree lines are almost identical to the way they were in 1862. Beautiful place to go walk and exercise east of Richmond. So just on this old map, just to get you oriented again to where we are, there's Richmond. James River squiggling its way east toward the Chesapeake Bay. Malvern Hill is there, east of Richmond, on the north side of the river. And we're going to talk about Harrison's Landing as well, which is even a little bit further east on the James River in Charles City County. Beautiful countryside, historic sites, old plantation houses, really neat place to go visit. So, from this area, Mid Coast Maine, the only regiment that recruited extensively from Mid Coast was the 4th Maine Infantry. And there were guys in Rockland and Lincolnville, and you can see all the place of all the borough. That's these guys. And 2 of these guys that we're going to focus on mostly are Benjamin Pottle and his brother Andrew, who lived in Lincolnville. So we pulled these names out of the Maine Adjutant General Report because now they list Rockland as their address, but that's where they were living at the time they enlisted. And that's how this book works. If you could have been born in Lincolnville, but if you were, making shoes in Rockland in 1861, that's your address for this book. So, a bunch of guys from Rockland, you can see them kind of spread around. That's the 4th Maine Infantry. Both Benjamin and his younger brother Andrew, were in the 4th Maine, and they were both at Malvern Hill. And we're going to hear a little bit more about them a little bit later. All right. Even though I haven't bored you much yet, that says you can ask a question or make a comment if I've lost you already. So there'll be more, assuming my remote works. So how do I find these guys? I kind of alluded to it earlier, but how do I find these guys? Well, not far from Malvern Hill is the Glendale National Cemetery, a series of national cemeteries that the federal government set up right after the war to bury all these Union guys that were unburied or partially buried around Virginia, around Richmond. So I went through this place and snooped around. Nobody there. Of all these national cemeteries around Richmond, nothing but Union guys, no Confederates in here. I never ran into anybody. And it's just, you're totally alone every time I went there. And I think that reflects in some ways lack of interest in the Civil War maybe. But it also reflects the fact that these are Union guys buried in the heart of Dixie. And, ain't too many families living around there who have a relative buried in that cemetery. But anyway, it was kind of a neat place to go. Quiet, beautiful, well kept. But for me, the method of tracking down these guys is find the grave and then go looking for the living man. So again, perspective, Malvern Hill there. Listen, you got a little point. Ooh, look at that, but you won't show up on TV. And then the cemetery not far down Willis Church Road. So the cemetery can look like. Now, this place has, you see, almost 1,200 soldiers buried, of which only 234 have their names. Everybody else is buried as unknown. Because these poor Union guys kind of sat in the ground or on the ground for almost 2 years, dead. And the Union Army was moving through these areas fast. They didn't hold any ground. They just moved. And so you'll see here in the Malvern Hill, the dead and wounded, they left them on the battlefield and kept going. They didn't even stop to bury them. They had to keep going. They couldn't hold ground with the Confederates right on their tails. So most of these guys are buried as unknowns. And for this group, they specifically designate these cemeteries for certain geographic areas, the Battle of Glendale and Malvern Hill. And you see the hospitals, the hospital victims, the people who died in the hospitals at Harrison Landing after these battles. So I trumped through the cemetery, looked at every stone. Not all of them were Civil War. And I said, oh, what about the Maine guys that got a name on them? There were only 13 in that whole cemetery that had a name and Maine. And 2 of those guys were from the 4th Infantry. And like I said, everything else is buried as unknowns. So, 2 from Maine, and I did a biographical search on these guys, and most of the time you have 10 Maine names and you try to find data, you might find some useful data on 1 or 2 of them. There's just so little, and these are guys, nobodies, no privates that nobody's ever heard of. But every once in a while you get lucky. And in this one, yeah, one guy, a Sergeant McClure, was 4th Maine, and then this man. B.F. Pottle. And that's all I knew. I had a stone, I had a name, I knew nothing else. So we're gonna find out something, just some biography on this man. Let's do that next. Believe me, it took a lot of searching, many hours, many websites. It took a lot of time. And things that you find are like the census record. Here's a census, the federal census from 1850. And Benjamin F. Pottle, he's 12 years old. His home, he's living in Lincolnville at that time. That's the Lincolnville census. The people from Lincolnville. There he is. His dad's there, Andrew D. Pottle, 39 years old. They list him as a shoemaker. And his younger brother is there, Andrew, who's 6 years old. That's 1850. If we go to just before the war, 1860, we got some guys there. We see Benjamin F. Pottle there. He now has a Rockland address, and he's 22 years old. Briefly, kind of family tree stuff. There's Benjamin, his parents, Andrew D. Pottle, his mother, Suzanne Pease, and they had kids. And Andrew, the younger, is in there as one of the kids. So basically, just to fill in the holes as to this young man, just the kind of the raw data. He was born in 1837 in Lincolnville. Address in 1860 was Rockland. Couldn't find any photos. that's not unusual. For most of these obscure privates, they didn't have a photo. Search the Maine archives, you're probably not going to find one. So I don't know what he looked like. I know a little bit, I knew some other things about him. He was listed in these records as a shoemaker like his dad. In the federal census in 1860, his net worth was $100. He did get married a couple years before the war to a Helen Kilsa, and they had one child, William F. Pottle. And he enlisted in 1861 into the 4th Maine Infantry at age 22, and he fought in this 1862 Peninsular Campaign. I did find that he was 5'7", brown hair and blue eyes. That gives me a little bit of connection to the guy. And going back to the Maine Adjutant General report, they list him, according to the state of Maine, and anything else I found, they list him as dying at Harrison's Landing on June 12th, 1862. That's 12 days after the battle. So by anything I found, that is as solid as we have that he died on that date at that location. But we got a lot of holes to fill in. How did that happen? So his brother, though, according to the state of Maine, what they knew at the end of the war, they lost him after Gettysburg. His brother Andrew survived this battle, continued to fight. 4th Maine was at Gettysburg, put up a good stand there at Devil's Den. The Gettysburg Commission, very accurate information, listed him as a POW from Gettysburg, his brother. We'll track that, but state of Maine, that's all they knew, that he was at Gettysburg and he was being sent to Richmond. And that's where the trail goes cold on the brother. You guys obviously know the Lincolnville honor roll, and here's where we got some Pottles. In the Civil War era, we got Nathan. And that's the only Pottle from the Civil War listed on there. Now, Nathan was living in Lincolnville at the time he enlisted. The other two boys, Andrew and Benjamin, were living in Rockland, so they don't make the wall.
So he's a brother of the other
cousin.
Oh, cousin.
First cousin. So you got to be living in Lincolnville at the time of enlistment to make the wall, apparently. As in the Vietnam era, there's Alan Pottle, who's actually still living.
No.
Oh, he's not?
No, passed away.
Recently?
Yeah.
2 years ago.
See, I always learn something.
Owned the Beatles shop.
And there were two brothers from World War II.
Howard and John.
So you guys know.
We knew John.
No, them both.
Nathan is buried just outside of Lincolnville Center. I tromped in there in the snow about 3-4 weeks ago and found his stone. So he's buried there, but you'll see on the stone, I didn't really spend much time researching him, but on his stone, it says he was killed at Petersburg, July 4th, 1864. So it's a whole other story how some guys got back from the Richmond area to be buried, and most of the guys didn't. Or are these actually false graves? It seems this.
Nobody.
We often don't know. But anyway, that's where Nathan is. He came home. So Rick Davis here is an excellent genealogist, lives in Belfast. He's in our audience, and we've communicated. And I'm not going to do a whole lot of genealogy. It's not as interesting to me. But Rick here had done the genealogy for the Pottle family recently. And origins go back to the 1700s. We got Nathan, as you guys, we mentioned, the first cousin of our two boys. And on it goes. We got Howard and John from World War II are direct descendants of our boys, and also Herbert Pottle, who just passed away in the last couple of years. So we can trace the Pottles, and if you ever really want to that much interested, Rick, where's Rick hiding? There he is, right there. He's got the data on this Pottle thing. So that's just what we know, the nuts and bolts about those boys, but we want to know what happened to them. Any comments yet? Okay. So we're going back to the Peninsular Campaign, and McClellan fighting like a dog, but he's about to say no mas. I need to get off this. I need to get off this peninsula. I'm heading back to the James River, get on my boats, and head back to the Chesapeake. But he was being pursued by Lee's army, and he was forced to stop before just getting to the James and fight this battle at Malvern Hill. He was pretty much forced into it. You got to stop. You got to fight these guys, or we're never getting to the river. There's one book about the 4th Maine, the only one I found that's devoted just to the 4th Maine, by Peter Dalton, with Our Faces to the Foe, and there's some good information in there. And like I was saying earlier, just geographically, we got Malvern Hill here on just north of the James, and let's see how the volume is on this.
Morning of July 1st, Birney marched his men to Turkey Island Bend on the James River. Upon his arrival, he received orders to immediately rejoin Heiselman, now on Malvern Hill. Elijah Walker remembered that, soon after arriving on the hill, a shell burst in my lines, killing Sergeant H.U. Cowling, and as I then suppose, mortally wounded Charles F. Wood. The brigade was immediately ordered to entrench.
So the 4th Maine is trying to get to the James River. Some fight was going on behind them. The Union High Command says, "Turn around, boys. We got to go back to Malvern Hill and fight." So, and when they got there, they suffered a casualty. There will be more. Malvern Hill, like much of the farmland around eastern Henrico County, looked like this at the time of the war. That sketch, some rolling farmland, and then that photo on the hill and the James River in the background is how it looked before the armies got there. And just again, for sort of nuts and bolts, the battlefield was set up with the Confederates to the west, McClellan and his guys out to the east, and it's going to be your typical armies marching against each other in an open field. Kind of rough on casualty. Now the 4th Maine is set up way over here on the right, the far right end of the Union lines. They can't get any farther to the right because there's geographic obstructions by Western Run. But that's where the 4th Maine guys are. Right there. So I took my camera and set up behind the Union line, sort of the left central, just to give you, I'm going to be right about here. The Union is set up here, and the rebels are going to be, the first wave of rebels are going to be coming from that field. So if I take my camera, West House is also a marker to page. It's a farmhouse, West House, that was there in 1862, and it's the only structure there now. So it's a nice little landmark right in the middle of the damn battle. And I'm just going to pan from behind that Union position, and you'll see some cannons here in a second. A little wind blowing up the field, and this is typical on the battlefield. I'm out here, you're not going to, there's nobody there but me, and the Confederates are going to be coming from that field. And just sketching again the hill with the Union and the Confederates coming across. So James River in the background with Union gunboats blasting away. I don't know how good their aim was. Yeah. So here, we're going to come back into the field. There's West House again. We're going to come back to where the first wave of Confederates marched toward the Union lines. And if you use your imagination, the Confederates heading east. I looked for literature that had first-hand observers for that battle, either soldiers or, it turned out, war correspondents, one from the south, one from the north. who gave fairly poignant descriptions of what they saw after the troops had collided. Again, we see the 4th Maine set up here on the far Union right, western run. I went to the woods and found that run. And the second wave is going to be coming through those woods next to Western Run and the parsonage, which is an old church house. And this is where the 4th Maine was set up.
Being between Couch's right and the left of Heinzelman, a point which invited attack, was held by a strong detachment from Palmer's and Birney's brigades, which were protected by entrenchments along their front. In the furious assault made on this portion of the line later in the day, these regiments assisted in repulsing the enemy.
That's the 4th Maine. On the far Union right, Birney was their commander. So in these history books, they did make note of the 4th Maine's position. So if we're looking at these Confederates marching up that hill and marching by what's left of the parsonage there, and Western Run is a barrier to the left, there's the 4th Maine, and that where that flag is planted back in that field is where the 4th Maine would be.
Am I right, the Confederates are coming uphill?
They're coming up to Malvern Hill.
Okay.
It's not a big rise, but it is elevated ground, which makes a difference.
Always
I think.
nice.
Always nice. Put your cannons on that elevated ground, you're gonna do some damage. But the Confederate attack stalls. They're repulsed after they cross that road into the bulk of the lines. That's as far as they got on that second wave. So looking again, now more to the center of the Union lines, looking left to right, there's the Confederates would have come from that field in the first line. Second wave would have come from those woods. We're panning to the right. Apple played a little bit of hitch in this. But there's the far Union right, and again I'll throw a flag where the 4th Maine is, way over there. I sort of like to walk these battlefields and find out where these guys were standing, using these historical records. So that blue dot is again where that flag was on the far Union right, where our boys, Andrew and Benjamin, presumably were standing. Line of Union cannon, there's the Confederate position. These woods, through the records I have, it's unclear how much of those woods were there in 1862. There was clearly woods in that ravine, but it completely obstructs the view of these Confederate forces who were coming through those woods. So I think there were some woods there, maybe not quite as dense as they are now. It's a little bit hard to tell from old maps. From old maps, I don't see any trees in front of the 4th Maine, at least not immediately in front. So this is just a point of interest. But if you stand on that spot where presumably my boys Benjamin and Andrew were, what's the geography? What's on the edge of that field? And as you walk to the right, you fall down a ravine toward Western Run, and if you walk forward, you fall down another ravine. So it's a semi-protected area that the Confederates, if they're going to come into that position, they get through that swampy area. That's hard. So the 4th Maine guys took some fire, but not as much as the other guys in line. So again, we're sort of panning right to left this time, looking across where the Union lines would be.
That's a big field.
Yeah.
That's big.
Well, it's big, but McClellan, with his huge army, didn't even have room for his army. He had them stacked up behind those positions, guys who were completely out of the action because they had no place to stand.
Wow.
They were just behind him.
How many did he have?
His army was 100,000 strong on the peninsula.
Wow.
And he thought he was outnumbered.
And he thought he was outnumbered. He always thought he was outnumbered. He was not outnumbered in this battle. So Stonewall Jackson is pushing his men toward Western Run, toward our blue dot, toward our 4th Maine guys. Not a full frontal assault because of the geography of the land, but troops are getting through there. And in this book,
The 4th Maine and 4 companies belonging to the 3rd were sent to occupy a wooded ravine in front of Kearny's line. As some of Stonewall Jackson's men advanced out of the woods and swamps, they ran into a small but determined band of skirmishers under the command of Elijah Walker. The scrappy Maine boys put up one hell of a defense.
so they were doing some fighting, but it was not, cannons weren't blasting away at them constantly from that position. So let's get into a little bit of the. This was I found in a record a pamphlet that had circulated in Charleston, South Carolina after this battle, where a Confederate correspondent recorded what he saw, and I have multiple like this. In the interest of time, I'm not gonna display all of them, but it's not for sensitive ears. Union gunboats banging away.
Fire was now appalling, and to add to the horror of the scene, the gunboats of the enemy in the river began to throw the most tremendous projectiles into the field. The column moved on nearer and yet nearer. Its ranks thinned at every moment and lost in sight in the thick curtain of smoke which overspread the crimson battleground. But once again the whirlwind of death threw the advancing mass of gallant men into inextricable disorder, and they retired.
And he's talking about the Confederate boys in
Yep.
this passage. It amazes me how the use of language in that period of time, how beautiful the prose was, even of the correspondents and even of the soldiers at times. So it's they learned English in school, yeah. So also this
Thus
Confederate.
closed the terrible battle on the 1st of July. The battlefield and the region round seemed as if the lightnings of heaven had scathed and blasted it. The forest shows and the splintered branches of 1,000 trees, the fearful havoc of the artillery. The houses are riddled, the fences utterly demolished, the earth itself plowed up in many places for yards. Here stands a dismantled cannon, there a broken gun carriage.
Now, there was also Union correspondents there. Joel Cook, who wrote, we have some Philadelphia people here somewhere. He wrote for the Philadelphia Free Press, and he then described the Union dead, and there's some passages from his writing that I'm not including here that were just god-awful. But I have a few.
Entering the field at the point where our artillery had been posted, I came upon numbers of dead and dying horses who, with the drivers and gunners, lay in a pile together, and several dismantled guns, their caissons fired and blown up by the enemy's balls, all presenting an aspect of desolation and ruin.
He's talking now about the Union boys.
Then came the point at which our infantry lines advanced to the open field and engaged those of the enemy. For a mile the ground was thickly strewn with the dead and dying, showing with what energy our men had advanced and with what energy they were repulsed. Men mangled in every conceivable manner, to the number of 10,000, were strewn out before me. There was one poor devil with his back broken, who was trying to pull himself along by his hands, dragging his legs after him to get out of the corn rows which the last night's rain had filled with water. Another, with both legs shot off, was trying to steady the mangled trunk against a gun stock in the ground. A fair-haired Yankee boy of 16 was lying with both legs broken, half of his body submerged in water, with his teeth clenched, his fingernails buried in the flesh, and his whole body quivering with agony and benumbed with cold.
What kind of weapons did they have as far as rifles? Were they
shells, or would they have to load them with powder and shot? And all?
Probably a little beyond my expertise. I didn't actually research that part to know what, but I'm sure we have people in the room who might know what the Union was carrying in 1862.
I actually have one at home, 1838 Springfield. And it was they were still making 1838 up to 1860s, but it's just a non-rifled musket.
Muzzle loading.
Yeah, muzzle loading. Yeah.
Yeah, so you had to put the powder and pack
Yeah,
it and all that.
you got your
Hurry up.
caps and everything. yeah.
The worst of the carnage in this battle, and much like it, were artillery. If you read these reports. So they fight on July 1st, and the Maine guys are on the far right. They're the last to be able to get out of the field because they're withdrawing to the James, which is on the opposite side. And it was quite a disturbing withdrawal. These boys had been up for 60 hours, very little to eat, very little to drink. They're damn near dead on their feet after 7 days of almost continuous battle. And they're marching off this field, pouring rain, middle of the night. It's pretty bad. There's guys just dropping out of line and dying as they march toward Harrison's Landing.
Fourth left the field and, still acting as rear guard, took up their march for Harrison's Landing, where they arrived at 9:00 a.m. during a severe rainstorm that prevailed, completely exhausted from what they had undergone the previous 60 hours. At Malvern Hill, 1 killed, 3 wounded, and 5 missing. The number missing were those who, from illness or fatigue, were unable to keep up and who, with the wounded, had to be left to be taken prisoners by the enemy.
So that's the stats for the 4th Maine. Casualty rate were not real high, again, given their location and what they were being asked to do. Not so for the rest of the armies. But that comes into play in us trying to figure out what happened to our boy Benjamin and Andrew when you're trying to figure out who, how many dead, how many wounded, missing. You need to know that to know what happened to these guys. So we have stats on the wounded. There were some wounded. Was Benjamin one of them? It's possible, but as I said earlier, the wounded in this battle were left on the field for the Confederates to scoop up. They had no opportunity to retrieve their own wounded given the dynamics of the battle. And the dead and wounded were left on the field. There were stats on missing. Could he have been one of the missing? Well, yes, missing often meant POW. It didn't necessarily mean just they couldn't find them. Back in 1862, with exchange of prisoners, it was pretty liberal. Often the Confederates took in these guys off the battlefield, made them sign a pledge, and sent them right back to the Union lines. They didn't hold them for very long. There were not a lot of POWs being moved from this battle back to Richmond. There may not have been any. So these are all possible scenarios for our boys, or at least for Benjamin, who we know died on July 12th. Was he wounded? If he's wounded, he would have had to still be able to walk, because the only way you can get to Harrison's Landing was to march. There was no way they're going to get you there unless you're on your own 2 feet. And he wasn't a POW because we know he ended up at Harrison's Landing. So wounded maybe, but he made it to Harrison Landing with the rest of the 4th Maine, and they were the last to leave the field by July 2nd.
Wounded and sick dragged themselves along, many a one lying down to sleep his last sleep under the grateful shade of the roadside woods. A confusion of wagons and soldiers and cannon and the paraphernalia of war blocked the passage, and in addition to the rebels thundering behind and the long, weary, dusty way before, hunger and thirst began to stare them in the face. Thousands had thrown away their haversacks containing all their food, and not a bite could they procure. Few streams or springs could be found to quench the thirst of the poor soldiers. They lay upon the ground, drinking from ditches filled with mud. Wells sometimes furnished a scant supply, but it was not 1/10 large enough for the army. Horses died from thirst and were left lying where they fell. Everywhere could be heard the cry for water. Harrison's Point was the spot chosen for the encampment of the Army and its restoration from the excessive fatigue it had undergone. The hundreds of vessels laden with supplies which had left White House were there, and everything was in readiness to provide for the wants of the soldiers.
So the battle was pretty bad. The march there was pretty bad. Harrison's Point had been set up by McClellan as a rendezvous spot to gather his army to eventually get them off the peninsula. And the Union had moved all kinds of supply boats. It was a massive operation to get almost 100,000 men recovering from these series of battles that had just taken place. But let me tell you, Harrison's Point was no Club Med. And it's very little is mentioned about it because it's that you don't hear about.
Wednesday morning, July 2nd, was ushered in by a severe and unrelenting northeast storm, which converted everything into mud and mire.
It's muddy, it's hot. These guys, again, marched from Malvern Hill down to that point on the James River. There were troops, there were tents, there were boats, there were supplies, but disease ran rampant on the Virginia lowlands in the middle of the damn summer. This is kind of what I walked to the where this camp would have been, this massive camp on the north bank of the river, and looked out. And this is what it looks like today on the James River at Harrison's Point. And if you stood at the plantation house there, Berkeley Plantation, on the front lawn and looked out, it looks like that. But in 1862, it would have looked like that. Tents, troops, boats.
Looks like Normandy.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, except these guys are there to rest. Ancestral home there, Berkeley Plantation, really neat to see some of the old plantations along the James River. The Harrison family occupied that. They abandoned it before the war, but President William Henry Harrison had lived there. 31 days after his inauguration, he died. His term as U.S. president was not very long. And there's the old manor house. So, you know, there's some descriptions of Harrison's Landing.
While Harrison's Landing was now guarded by extensive fortifications and by the gunboats and was safe enough, it was a miserable encampment. In these July weeks, the James River bottomland was steamy and endlessly hot. On July 15th, Lieutenant Hayden recorded in his journal a temperature of 103 degrees in the shade. Everyone was crowded together, and the water was bad.
Oh boy, dysentery. Oof. That killed a lot of people, right? Dysentery.
It did indeed.
The plague of flies drove men and animals to distraction. The list of the sick lengthened, especially those with dysentery, and Chickahominy fever was renamed the James River fever. Private E.O. Hicks noted in his diary on July 19th, "A good many of our boys are sick, and everywhere around the hospitals we can see the dead laid out almost every morn." The Potomac Army had 42,911 reported cases of illness during July.
So, this all comes into play as to what happened to our boy, Benjamin. I was lucky enough to find this list. Burials at Harrison's Landing, the names of soldiers in the 4th Maine who were buried, obviously died at Harrison's Landing because they didn't take the dead back from the battlefield. And sure enough, our boy is on that list. They spelled his name wrong, but we have a record that he was buried at Harrison's Landing. That's And the sites would have looked like this, just out there on the edge of a field, some wooden markers in the soil, and there you go. Actually, one of the tour guides at Berkeley, I interacted with him, and he said in his exploring of the property that he found some old Union burial sites on the edge of the plantation. So if we think about this, all we know from the Maine records is he died on July 12th at Harrison Landing. What would have happened to him? We know he was at Malvern Hill. We know he fought there. We know he would have marched out. So given the time frame and the position on the field, we feel really confident he didn't get shot during the battle or didn't die during the battle. And the timing and the conditions at Harrison would strongly suggest he died of disease.
Yeah.
The Union records don't say that, but that's the most likely scenario for someone on July 12th at Harrison Landing. Terrible sanitary conditions.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of fighting going around Malvern Hill, but again, the 4th Maine did not report any deaths from gunshot by the time they got to Harrison Landing. There was some fighting and skirmishing going on there. So of all the possibilities, that to us would seem the most likely. Now, with information that Rick Davis provided from pension records, now the pension records of the family, they knew about his death within a month or two afterwards, and they're trying to gather information so they can get his pension. They want to be able to prove to the government that he was there and how he died, and so you're eligible to get pension. So from that, his widow, on the pension application, mentioned that he died aboard this steamer, USS Vanderbilt. See, Rick, I put your name on there. And I looked up that boat, and it was originally a transatlantic passenger ship and a mail steamer. The Navy got it in March of 1862, so just before this battle, and re-outfitted it. I expect they picked it up in Newport News and would have come up the Chesapeake, then up the James, is probably where it was. But it has a record of being refitted with heavy guns in the New York Naval Yard in the summer of 1862. So it could have been used as a hospital boat there in July, and then after that ended up in New York for refitting. So if he was on that boat, and that's the boat, they were clearly using ships for hospital medical care at Harrison's Landing. So he could have been on there. He probably died on that boat, but they still would have buried him in the ground at Harrison's Landing. They wouldn't have shipped his body back to Maine.
I read that slightly different.
Tell me.
He got captured. He was a
There is
POW
those-
according to Rick.
Right.
And very common that when they were paroled, usually because they were gonna die, when they're paroled, they put them on a ship to get them back to the Union lines.
Right. In this case, the Confederates didn't have any ships that I know of operating in that area at
No,
that
they
time.
put them on our ship,
Oh.
a flag of truce ship.
Right. That's possible. As I said earlier, the exchange and parole at that point was really fast. So
Yes.
Unlike in 1863, when the 4th Maine was at Gettysburg, those guys got marched from Gettysburg back to Richmond and had a hellish existence there for months.
Yeah.
But here, they would have let them, whether it be put them on a ship and bring them back, that's entirely possible.
That's what that looking like.
That is entirely possible if we speculate. Well, those are all possibilities.
I think this early in the war, I mean, this is basically, McClellan was put in charge after the disaster of Bull Run. And his plan was a brilliant amphibious landing, but I think the objective would be Richmond. And then early in the war, they really didn't have, they all thought the war was gonna be over in 6 months. It was just gonna be quickly, we're gonna rout out the rebels, and it's gonna be over. I don't think there was really an exit plan. And I think probably, it was more ships to supply logistics at the time at the site, and it really wasn't for getting 100,000 men back
Right.
out of it.
You're exactly right. And this battle in particular, and the 7 Days battle in general, as this news, like the correspondence you got into Charleston and Philadelphia, it's the first time that John Q. Public especially in the North, realize, oh crap, this is some bad stuff going on here. We didn't know that it was going to be this bad. And really, this series of battles was the first to kind of broadcast the horrors of war to the general public. And you're right, they were
This was the first battle really Abraham Lincoln said to McClellan, do something.
Sure.
I mean, he did a great job of taking the Army of the Potomac.
Yeah.
That's what he shaped it into a real army. I think it was a rout out of the whole run. So I mean, I think a lot of these guys, they were all trained by Lee. I mean, I think McClellan was a West Point. He was very full of himself, like a typical general at that time. And he basically, I think it was a lot of psychological, like you said, he outnumbered Lee. But you're going against Bobby Lee. I mean, this was a guy who was a commandant at West Point. You know, the only guy that really had you know, any kind of combat experience of the Mexican-American War. So I think he was really psyched out, and it was just a mess.
So we have some pension record that got back to family. His wife eventually remarried and died in New Hampshire in 1908. From that same book, Peter Dalton, he gave some names of people who died of disease. We're speculating disease, but Pottle's name was not on there. Now, granted, you got to understand, none of these records are solid in their data, but even if he wasn't listed officially as dead from disease in these records, it's possible that he could have been listed as wounded, and then his wound got infected. And he died essentially from an infected wound, but he might have been on the casualty list as wounded. But either way, these are just things that we would speculate, much like you said, on POW status, exchange, put him on a boat, send him back to the Union. Any of that's possible. So let's see. His younger brother survived that and continued fighting. He was listed in the record as a POW, as we said earlier, at Gettysburg from July 2nd. That's really the last we see his name in Union records. So I did find it as a little project to find out, to verify what really happened to Andrew since the official record. Now, he was also 5'7", brown hair, and hazel eyes, but we don't have a picture of him. He's there again. We saw him on the 1850 census in Lincolnville. He's listed as a shoemaker, like his dad, in one record. From Family Search genealogy, there, which is a lot of information provided by family, as you know. They list him as, and this is the record on Ancestors, not the official government record, but some family member realized that he died in Andersonville in Georgia in 1864. How did he get there? How the heck did he get to Georgia? So we know he was living in Rockland, although in the records, census records from Rockland, he said he's listed as a sailor. Must have got tired of making shoes. So again, Gettysburg, we're not going to get into what the 4th Maine did there, other than to say that on July 2nd, they were occupying positions near the Devil's Den and were overrun by the Georgia boys, General Benning. He no longer has a fort named after him, by the way. And Benning took a lot of prisoners. And I'm not going to show it in this talk, but I spent hours and hours. There's the Georgia boys moving in on the Maine boys, almost surrounding them. They took 72 4th Maine prisoners. The Georgia guys did. 4th Maine, 72. I'm sorry. Let me take that back. There were 72 reported as missing or POWs, and of those, 62 were soldiers, and they marched those suckers back to Richmond. Because, according to the military records, if you're a prisoner of war on July 2nd, you're at Gettysburg. And if you were now in Richmond, you were in the POW system in Richmond. And if you were private, like Andrew, you were on Belle Island. And that's a whole nother lecture I have. And that was a hellhole, let me tell you. That was bad. I only make a passing reference to being 1863, all the Union POWs in the Eastern Theater were sent to Richmond, and most of them ended up on Belle Island. And that's what it looked like, sort of as a sketch. And the only photograph of that, and this didn't even begin to do it justice, because you're sitting here in the nice spring weather overlooking the James River. The only records, the Confederates didn't keep very good records of their prisoners or those who died, let alone where they were buried, but NGOs came in, like the U.S. Christian Commission, and were allowed to survey some of the cemeteries scattered around Richmond and keep a record of names of Union dead that were buried there. And I've looked at those lists. That's about the only halfway decent list we have of Union prisoners in Richmond. And there you see sort of a view of the cemetery on Belle Island and the list of names that the Christian Commission saw on wooden planks at grave sites, what few were left. And on those lists, I scoured those lists. I scoured any of the burial lists from Richmond and the list of the national cemeteries where these guys would have been reinterred after the war. And Andrew Pottle ain't on those lists. So this, if we have information that he died in Andersonville, that makes sense, because he ain't on any of these lists as being dead in Richmond. One of the few officers that was on Belle Island, they were all hoping beyond hope for exchange to go back, but very few of them were. And in early February 1864, the Confederates loaded them on trains and sent them south. They were
About the middle of February, the rebel government directed Belle Island to be cleared. Accordingly, detachments of several hundred prisoners every few days were taken off, and it was supposed by those remaining the exchange was resumed. Lieutenant G.E. Saber. When we were placed on board the cars, I inquired of one of the guard where they were taking us. His reply was to Camp Sumter in Georgia. I was not at all surprised by this intelligence and made up my mind for the worst.
And I have at home
Lieutenant G.
a collection of first edition books that are a lot of these journals and diaries by these soldiers, of first-hand accounts written shortly after the war, most of them, about their experiences in these POW situations, and it's pretty bad. But at Andersonville, again, to track our boy Andrew, there were a few lists. The Confederates kept in their medical facility a list of dead prisoners, and some Union guys working in that facility was able to clandestine get a hold of those lists, and some of them were then sent north, or some of them were published after the war. So we do actually have lists of dead from Andersonville that are fairly good. And on that list, A.E. Pottle is on that list. This one is a death registry published in the New York Tribune in 1866, a list that was taken by a former prisoner and taken north after the war. And we see A.E. Pottle. They got the wrong unit. They had him a cavalry unit, and he died May 25th, 1864, of dysentery, diarrhea. He's on that list, and I've seen him on more than one list for Andersonville. So he didn't do too good. So, more confirming today, you look back in the Maine records, there's nothing that shows that our boy Benjamin ever made it back to Maine. We're pretty confident of that. We got good records that Andrew never made it back to Maine. And so those boys did not survive the war. We don't know exactly where they were on the field at Malvern Hill, or the status of their POW stats, where they held back a certain portion. We don't know quite those comings and goings, but they were likely both there, and they likely fought together in that series of battles. And again, another list that's been rewritten for Pottle. And on this list too, they also include his gravestone number. at the reinterment for Andersonville, because I'm trying to find out where these guys were buried. Most of them were buried in these mass trenches at Andersonville. But for whatever reason, they recorded a grave number 1361 at the National Cemetery, just like in these other cemeteries we showed. Some guys got their name, and most don't. All the stones have a number, though. This one, 1361, and through another source, who find a grave.
Who would have placed the stones?
Who would have? Federal government.
Okay.
Yeah, these are all federal, after the war, federal government. And 1361 is there. For some reason, they didn't carve his name on it. That's just another one of these little mysteries. When you're dealing with these obscure soldiers, a lot of questions and not a whole lot of answers. But as best we know, that's him. So, briefly, his father, who enlisted actually at age 45, the timing was kind of interesting. He enlisted shortly after Benjamin died, and he dropped out around the time Andrew Jr. was taken as a POW. And we don't know for sure whether he knew Andrew Jr. was taken prisoner or where he was, but he enlisted. Different company, different regiment, and again, Andrew and Susanna and their boys. This from Rick, again, genealogy gives us some nice genealogy of the Pottle family, including Andrew, and who he married and who he's related to, and sure enough, he's in, the dad, Andrew, is in the Maine Adjutant General Report for the 28th Regiment, 45, living in Rockland. We have his military records, listing him as shoemaker, as we've seen, born in Searsmont, resident in Rockland at the time of the war. We can get a lot of that good stuff.
What kind of identification did these soldiers carry with them?
Virtually none.
Because, they didn't have dog tags back then.
Yeah, they, for some of these worst battles, if they knew what was coming, they scribbled their name on a piece of paper and stuffed it in their jacket. Some had journals. I have another talk about a journal that one of these soldiers from Waldo County kept. Probably they identified him by that.
Some of them wrote it on the back of their uniform.
But as you can see from the numbers, most of them were buried as unknowns. Actually, Andrew Sr. re-enlisted in 1863, but he played in a band, so people weren't shooting at him. But he came back to Maine. He survived the war. He probably still had his flute. And we got some death records that I got from the Rockland Historical Society. List his death. He was 83 years old. At the time of his death, he was the oldest living Maine veteran of the Civil War in 1892, I believe. We have his burial record at Acorn Cemetery, that off Old County Road. So this guy, we have a little more because he came back. We got the records there from the Rockland Historical Society. So you stomp around Acorn, and you find good old Andrew D. Pottle. There he is. There he is, and he's buried next to his second wife, Susan. He died there at age 83 in 1894. We got records on Susan. There she is, the mother of Ben and Andrew. And we also had his sister buried right next to him. Small little family collection there. So ultimately, this journey has followed this family, the Pottles. We followed these two boys. I decided to go back one day to Benjamin's there at Glendale in Henrico County, give him a Maine hat. One of the guys that had his diary, I went back to his tombstone, put his diary there that I had acquired. And it was like one of these, first time the soldier and his diary had been together in 157 years. It's like, it's like Twilight Zone kind of stuff. And so we got Benjamin all taken care of. We think Andrew's over there in Andersonville. We're good for him. We got Dad over there in Acorn, and we got cousin Nathan over here in Lincolnville. We got we got the family all taken care of on this talk. But it was, they definitely went different pathways in what was a huge American tragedy. But Lincolnville did its share. Lincolnville did its part. So I will leave that. I'll leave that alone. Any thoughts about that?
Wow.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so I said I've tried to focus on Mid Coast, Waldo County soldiers and follow them in Richmond. Some survived, some didn't. Because most of my audiences are Mid Coast audiences and Virginia audiences. Actually, I have a talk in Virginia in a couple of weeks about a Maine boy from Waldo County.
Yeah?
What's some of the battlefields we went down to in Virginia?
I forgot there was one battlefield where Stonewall Jackson got shot by his
Chancellorsville.
Yeah, by his own men.
Yeah, 1863, Chancellorsville.
Yeah, we were there and just, like you showed those mounds, you see the mounds.